and just starting to lay. And then there's only maybe a frame of egg in there. That's okay. Just sample from wherever you can find the most brood. At that point, most of the mites are going to be on the adult bees anyway. Or in the case where you have a queen that's maybe winding down or it's queenless, so you have a capped frame, only capped frames of brood, just yeah, sample from that capped frame. Again, you're going to have a lot of mites on that frame or on your adult bees rather than, yeah, in the brood if you don't have a lot of brood in there. And this is in the circumstance that, yeah, you have mites in the colonies already. So anybody have anything to add there? Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Cooper, one for you. You mentioned in other countries that they weren't able to stop the spread of Varroa between the islands. Do you think there's any lessons or specific lessons that we might be able to apply here in the Australian context to keep Varroa out of, say, WA, Northern Territory and Tassie?
Yes, absolutely. Hopefully we can keep it out of those areas for as long as possible. But obviously for the land mass, if you got any bees moving across the country or between those areas is going to obviously exacerbate the risk. That's very obvious. But I'm sure those states will be doing a lot to try to reduce any bees coming into those states. I think there's a lot of lessons in that. It's the onus is on every beekeeper, and to be really looking out for those mites, for those states to be able to have access to sticky mats and strips so that if, they do have a detection, so they can sort of deploy them pretty quickly to be able to work out how far that mite is sort of spread would be pretty ideal. And also just different mechanisms. I mean, if you look at New Zealand, Varroa mite arrived there in 2000 in the North Island, but the South Island beekeepers there paid a voluntary levy to be able to increase their surveillance. They were able to keep that mite out for about 6 years, so it still wasn't, able to do it in the long run. But yeah, definitely some lessons that can be learned. But I think the emphasis is really the onus is on the beekeeper for everyone to be looking out for it.
Thanks, Cooper. You mentioned that they increased their surveillance in the South Island. Does that mean that they were inspecting every hive that was crossing that border? And do you think that's something we could realistically do in Australia?
I think that beekeepers could do a lot more surveillance themselves. That's for sure. We've all got access to monitoring sort of equipment. It's not difficult to do. It doesn't take a lot of time. So, but in terms of the actual program that was rolled out, there's probably more details in that than we want to have an answer for right now. But yeah, basically just increased surveillance through existing protocols and processes through government departments and associations that are working closely with them, and yeah, just the beekeepers getting on board with it.
Great, thank you. So I think everyone on the panel would agree that ongoing and continued surveillance of all your hives would be ideal in this situation. All right, Rod, one for you. Do you think it's safe to bring bees back into the management zone?
Really?
No.
Definitely, it's time now for us to get back in our beekeeping. Eradication didn't succeed. We now need to learn how to deal with mites, and the best way to do that is to jump in both feet. So get your bees back in, and just start monitoring and just manage your bees, see how they go. You might have some failures, but then you learn from your mistakes, and now's the time to do it while we've got pretty clean mites that don't have viruses on them. So yeah, get back into it.
Great, thanks, Rod. One for you, Liz. So someone's sent in a question that they don't want to use any toxic chemicals. Can you cover some options that they can use if they don't want to use chemicals and where they get used?
Yeah, sure thing. So the first thing every beekeeper should start with as a baseline is that monitoring. So knowing when your mite levels are reaching that damaging level. But there's tools that you can implement even before you have, I guess, a single mite, such as if you're at a hobby or recreational small scale, you can have ventilated bottom boards. Those are not a full control for your varroa mites, but it's a little something. Another tool that small scale beekeepers or commercial beekeepers that have the labor and capacity to really intensely manage that brood nest can also use is drone trapping. So putting a frame of drone brood in the colony, which is much more attractive to mites. they'll make a beeline, now we need all these mite puns. They'll make a beeline for that drone brood. They'll get capped and trapped in the drone brood, and then the beekeeper must take the drone brood out before it starts hatching. Otherwise, it'll be a mite explosion and the exact opposite of what you want to do. You can, chuck it in your freezer, dispose of it in a biosecure way, and put another frame of drone brood in as the other one's being capped. So you can just be continually trapping mites in the drone brood. That one is, however, seasonally restricted to when the colony is raising drones. Now, those tactics won't be enough at a certain stage, and you'll have to intervene with some other control. And there's non-synthetic organic treatments that DPI either has registered or is currently looking to register. So right now, our regulatory body, the Australian Pesticide Veterinary Medicines Authority, has approved formic acid and Apigard. To my knowledge, neither of those are yet in the country, but those two will be available at some stage, hopefully soon. But they do have caveats in terms of temperature restrictions. So Apigard, for example, a thymol-based gel formulation, if it's nice and hot outside, like it is, you'll need to use less of it, and specific amounts, kind of half doses, depending on the size of your colony. So it will pay for all our listeners to go back to the DPI Managing Varroa site and check out some new fact sheets coming up that Kelly Lease has written on how to read your chemical label, which is the law, the safety data sheets relevant to that, so you can understand those temperature restrictions and how to use these chemicals, either synthetic or organic, safely.
Great. Thanks, Liz. And would you recommend a range of strategies?
Definitely. So Varroa essentially needs all the strategies thrown at it. So you start with your non-chemical controls, your cultural and your mechanical controls. And another tool I should have mentioned that beekeepers can kind of take ownership of is selecting for Varroa resistance within domestic stock or through legal pathways of importation where that's already been selected for.
Great. Thanks, Liz. All right, Madeline, over to you. So this question's around nutrition. So how can I know the nutrition of the pollen sources that my colonies are collecting?
Yeah, so that can be a bit of a tricky one because sometimes you have pollen coming in and you either, like, I think the first go-to would be to actually observe, like, what sort of colors can you see that the bees are bringing in? Like, is it just the one color? Are they bringing in different types of pollen colors? And usually if they are bringing in, we say about 3 different types, like that is a good indication that they're getting a variety of pollen sources. And even if some of the pollen sources might be slightly deficient, that they're still able to get that nutrition by having access to a range. But there is also some indications to how good that nutrition source may be. And usually that means that different plant species fall into like a plant family or into a group, and they can be of similar nutrition in terms of pollen. So for example, one that comes to mind is the daisy family. So that could be capeweed, fireweed, dandelions. They all are orange pollens. So if it is an orange pollen, for example, that's coming in, there's a very high chance that it is part of that plant family. And with those ones, we, for example, do know that they're all low in protein, they have a high fat content, so they have all some similarities amongst them. But there are also some resources out there, and one of the best resources I can recommend is Honey and Pollen Flora of Southeastern Australia, written by Doug Somerville, the famous Bee Floral Bible. And there's some very good information there about the nutritional qualities of pollens and also when are different tree species flowering. So be very observant in terms of what's flowering in your area. And then hopefully with some resources, you'll be able to get more of an understanding of what sort of nutrition the hives have access to in your specific environment.
Great, Madeline. And I just have a follow-up question on that. So if someone's unfamiliar with the flora in their area and they only see one colour of pollen coming in, should they supplement or should they look in the brood box and have a look at a pollen bank and maybe how much brood they've got?
Well, you definitely need to match the resources with what is happening inside of the hive and what the status of that colony is. So and also linking that back to Varroa in ways, I think the most critical part is to actually manage the periods of time where you are suddenly going through a shortage in nutrition. So you might be experiencing, okay, the bees are bringing in good nutrition, 3 different pollen types. Suddenly some resources switch off. For example, right now where it's getting really hot, ground cover is drying up, the bees are not collecting that variety anymore. And that's where it is important to look into potentially supplementary feeding the hives. But that is also involves around like your specific area, like what are the bees still having access to. But definitely if resources are dropping off and you're managing hives, specifically like if you are depending on what your goals are in terms of the hives as well, whether you're using them for honey production, pollination services, or just trying to keep them as healthy as you can. Supplementary feeding is definitely a good option and something that everyone should be keeping on top of to manage the nutrition and the health of the hive, specifically also in the context of Varroa.
Great. Thanks, Madeline. That was fantastic. Mark, over to you. So we've got a question about what's the recommended wall thickness for a stingless beehive?
They do vary. Most are around your 25 millimeters to 50 millimeters. They're generally around the same external size. Timber in different thicknesses insulates, better. So majority are around the 50 mil. Materials used can be your hoop pines, radiators. It's important not to use a treated pine or anything like that. We generally don't paint inside a hive, just leave it natural. A lot of cypress is used. My findings are around the 50 mil where I am because it does seem to insulate on, in those kind of colder or warmer conditions.
Great. Thanks, Mark. All right, back to you, Emily. Got another one for you. Is there a certain time of year when it's more important to monitor for varroa mite, or should we just be monitoring all the time?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So yeah, short answer to that is it's important to monitor in every season as the population dynamics change in your colonies. But it is really critical in the spring as your bee populations are going up, then mite populations are also likely going up with your bees. So definitely important to be monitoring then, and then also when the mite populate or when the bee populations are going down into the autumn, it's really critical as well because those mite populations can kind of peak right after your bees hit their peak population, and then once the bees start declining in their population, those mite levels can really get really high in proportion to the amount of bees in your colony. So those are really critical moments, but I think, yeah, it's important to monitor consistently throughout the season because those dynamics will change. But another thing I wanted to note is that it's also important to monitor right after you do a treatment. So if you put miticides in your colonies because you've monitored and you're surpassed that threshold, definitely make sure to monitor after your treatment to make sure the treatment was actually effective. So, yeah, thanks.
No worries. So how soon after treatment should you monitor? Like what's the sort of time frame for people?
Basically as soon as possible. I mean, as soon as you take that treatment out, it's probably good to do that check. But yeah, as soon as you can, I think is probably the best rec. So.
Great, thank you. Cooper, another one for you. So in your talk, you talked about resistance to miticides and that being an issue and a major problem for beekeepers in other places. Are there any tips for people as we venture on this Varroa journey about avoiding resistance to miticides?
Yes, absolutely, Kelly. So in every other country where Varroa exists, there's resistance to some different types of miticides to different levels and extents. So basically, you're putting chemicals in a beehive and they're not as effective as you'd hope that they're going to be. So it is a major problem globally, and it's really up to us as individuals and the decisions that we make in our operations, whether we're going to be in that basket case of paying good money for chemicals and putting them in hives and they're not that effective. So it's really up to us as individuals. I don't work for Bunnings, but I love going to Bunnings. But it's not the place to necessarily just go on the weekend to buy chemicals and put them in your beehive. You wouldn't go to the pharmacy to buy, like you'd only go to the pharmacy to buy things if you're going to treat, an issue on your own health. It's the same for your bees. You don't just get random things. These chemicals and miticides have been developed by scientists over many years. There's lots of data and research to support their use for the safety of beehives, the bees themselves, the food products, and also human health safety concerns. So using registered chemicals, please, look out for what DPI are doing. They're doing an amazing job registering those ones that are used around the world and they're fit for purpose. Using less than the recommended dose, that's something that I've seen in other countries as well, just trying to take a shortcut, cutting strips up, putting them across different hives. Yes, they will kill some of the mites, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be as effective as they need to be for those mites treatments to be effective long term. Not rotating chemicals, that's another thing. So, and when we say chemicals, I don't mean the name of the packet. I mean the active chemical class itself, the actual type of active chemical within that treatment. So you can have the same chemical that's in two different names or different products, if that makes sense. So make sure you're checking that out. Not removing strips, that's another one. So the mites are just getting, access to a little bit of chemical, but not enough to knock down the majority of them. So a good tip there is just if you're not already writing on the top lids of your beehives, keep a note. When are those treatments going in? When do they need to come back out? Put it in your logbook as well. So there's some tips trying to reduce resistance issues.
Great, thanks, Cooper. So what I'm hearing from all of that is read and follow the label directions exactly, and don't take shortcuts.
Pretty much.
Great, thank you. Rod, here's a one about swarms. So do you think it's safe to keep a swarm that has lots of varroa mites in it? And I might add, is it advisable?
Oh, definitely. Like I said before, we're on the journey to learn about managing mites in beehives. So you get mites in your swarm, okay, manage the mites. That's the whole thing. It's not a risk for any beekeeper that already has some experience. It's another challenge, but most of us have already done a lot of research and we know that using different chemicals will kill mites. And yes, we might not get those chemicals in before some of the mites get into the first brood that goes into the hive. But when those mites hatch a couple of weeks later, if we've got strips in, those mites are going to die too. So we need to start getting experience with mites. So the only way to do that is to jump in the deep end. So don't wrap yourself in cotton wool. Don't panic when you find your first mites. Start learning how to deal with them.
Great, thanks, Rod. You heard it here first. Rod says, go out and catch yourself a swarm and let's start managing varroa. All right, Liz, one for you. These are about hot and cold. So someone's asked, does freezing kill mites? And on the flip side of that, is there any evidence to support heating as a treatment for varroa?
Good questions. Yeah, the whole spectrum there. Yeah, luckily we don't have Arctic mites. They've originally evolved with Apis cerana in Southeast Asia, so they kind of like it hot. They kind of like it broodness, temperature. That's their ideal. So yes, they will die by freezing, but freezing, I guess I'm not sure where that's coming from. Freezing is a good means of ensuring your equipment is free of mite. Say if you've got honey supers that you've harvested the honey from, if those have come from a zone where varroa mite is present, then they could have varroa mite in them. So if you're operating your barrier system, you might think, okay, well, this might be a risk point where mites could be transferred from one hive to another. So you could put those sticky supers, extracted supers in the freezer for a couple days before you put them out to a new yard. And then the question about mite heating. So yes, that has been looked at as a tool, a mechanical tool for killing mites, but it's still, I suppose, not a reliable method of mite control. So there's some tools that have been developed or studied in that area, but it's not at the, I guess, stage that we can recommend it as a reliable control tool.
Great, that makes sense. Thanks, Liz. All right, Madeline, one for you. So with Varroa, will the nutritional requirements of my colonies increase or change?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Kelly. In ways like they're not, the nutritional requirements are not going to change of a colony, but I think again what is super critical in that, or once we're dealing with Varroa in the mix, is to manage those periods of times where nutrition might be slightly suboptimal. And that is the times when the bees will be more susceptible to any viruses and be more affected by the damage that Varroa is doing. So those are the periods of times where we have to really be on top of the nutrition of the hives and make sure that they constantly have access to all the nutrients that they need.
Great, thank you. Mark, a last question for you. What can we do for stingless bees on hot days?
Oh, yes, good question. And that does relate to us here, certainly on the mid-north coast, where we get those days. They will handle a day 35 degrees, but it's when we go those consecutive ones as, kind of like heat wave, we're 35, the next day it's 37, and if we're approaching 40 degrees on the third day, they find it very hard to bring that, and high overnight temperatures occur as well. So they find it very hard to keep that, temperature out of the hive. It does penetrate over time. So they're the biggest risk ones. The good thing about these little guys is most of the family is not concerned if you put a screen mesh over the front and bring them into your air conditioning. Not something we can do with Apis mellifera, because most of the family would be quite upset with that. Important there, a lot of hives have a little drill hole at the back or the opposing side of the entrance. Occasionally bees will open that up once you've brought them in, so maybe a bit of mesh over that just in case. So yes, you can do that. Damp towels, the wicking method with the bucket of water next to the hive and a damp towel in the bucket over the hive, that can work. So that, the thing is we can close them off for a day or two. Generally, a front will come through, things will cool, and we can pop them back outside. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark. One last question for Rod, and it's sort of a double question. So someone's asked, when can we expect the mite bomb to happen in New South Wales? And a follow-on from that someone has had their hives euthanized a year ago. Can they start beekeeping right now?
Yep. So the mite bombs have been building up for a long time. Because we don't have viruses in the varroa mites, the bees are actually able to tolerate a very high number of mites. Now, I don't know if this will work. I'm going to put my little photo up. I don't know. Can you see that? Not very easily, but that's an alcohol wash of 277 mites from 328 bees in a colony. So that is like 80% infestation rate, that's just out of this world. We're only seeing that because we don't have viruses here yet that are impacting the bees. So the mites in the environment are just building up and up and up. And some of these colonies will succumb, they will get stressed, the hive beetle will get them, or a brood disease or something, and there may be robbing. And it's probably happened since before the end of last year, which would probably indicate some of the natural spread that we were seeing. Lots of mites in the environment. Maybe the colonies were still reasonably healthy, but a lot of field bees were taking mites out with them. In this colony, we're able to get photos of 2 mites on the underside of one bee and mites just crawling around on top of bees. So a lot of mites, and so we are already experiencing mite bombs, but the atomic bombs will come when the viruses get here, and then that's going to be terrible because as well as the mites, there'll be viruses with it. So That's what we need to get ready for before all that stuff happens, Armageddon down the track, like New Zealand and everywhere else. But as far as you lost your hives a year ago, and I'm sorry to hear it, I know how it feels. Yeah, go and get your bees as soon as you can. It's all about learning to manage mites and doing it now while the mites are not as hurtful on the bee colonies. Gives us some margin of error to learn how to use things and in our different seasons, because like I said before, if the viruses get here, we need to be really, really good at controlling mites and looking at treating when those 2 to 3% thresholds are hitting our bees in alcohol washes. So let's learn as much as we can now and then get ready if things change later on.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rod. And I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who presented a talk today and to our expert panel of speakers today on the Q&A. And on behalf of Tocal College and the DPI, I'd like to say thanks for tuning in to the 44th annual Tocal Beekeepers Field Day, Australia's longest running field day. I hope that you've learnt something today. And if you want more information, please visit the DPI website. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.